In the darkness of a Burmese jungle, on a night when the monsoon rains had finally ceased their relentless pounding, one man would make a stand that defied every law of warfare, every expectation of human endurance, and every calculation of military odds. This is the story of a soldier so small that the army nearly rejected him, so determined that death itself could not stop him, and so fierce that his enemies would remember his name long after the war had ended. What unfolded on that blood-soaked night of May 12th, 1945, was not just a battle. It was a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the human soul when cornered, wounded, and facing impossible odds. The man at the center of this extraordinary tale stood just 4 feet 11 inches tall, weighed barely more than a sack of rice, and had been turned away from military service multiple times because he was considered too small, too weak, too insignificant to matter in the grand machinery of war. His name was Lachhiman Gurung, and by the time the sun rose on May 13th, 1945, that name would be written in blood across the pages of military history. This is the story of how one wounded Gurkha, fighting with a single functioning arm, held off over 200 Japanese soldiers for 4 straight hours in what would become one of the most savage individual stands ever recorded. But to understand the magnitude of what happened that night, we must first journey back to the harsh mountains of Nepal, where poverty carved men from stone and desperation forged warriors from boys who had nothing left to lose. Lachhiman Gurung was born on December 30th, 1917, in the remote village of Dakhani, nestled deep in the Taungdaw district of Nepal. Here, among terraced hillsides and ancient paths worn smooth by generations of bare feet, life was a daily struggle against starvation, disease, and the unforgiving geography of the Himalayas. His family owned nothing but a small plot of land that yielded barely enough rice to keep them alive through the harsh mountain winters. By the time Lachhiman reached adulthood in 1940, malnutrition and deprivation had left their mark. Standing barely under 5 feet tall and weighing less than most teenage boys, he was small even by the standards of the hill people of Nepal. Yet within that diminutive frame burned an ambition that towered over the mountains themselves. He wanted to join the British Indian Army, to serve alongside the legendary Gurkha regiments whose reputation for courage and ferocity had spread across the empire. Again and again, he presented himself at recruitment stations, only to be turned away. The recruiters would look at his slight build, his malnourished appearance, and shake their heads. He was too short, they said, too weak. The British Army had standards, and this scrawny farm boy from the hills simply did not meet them. Under peacetime conditions, Lachhiman Gurung would never have been allowed to wear the uniform he dreamed of. But by 1940, peace was a luxury the world could no longer afford. Adolf Hitler's war machine was rolling across Europe, and in the Pacific, the rising sun of Imperial Japan cast its shadow over Asia. The British Empire found itself fighting for its very survival, and suddenly, the luxury of being selective about recruits became a privilege they could not maintain. The army needed every man who could hold a rifle, regardless of his size. In December 1940, at the age of 23, Lachhiman Gurung finally received the acceptance he had fought so hard to earn. He was assigned to the 8th Gurkha Rifles, joining the ranks of men whose ancestors had once fought against the British Empire, but now served as some of its most loyal and feared warriors. What he lacked in physical stature, he would prove to possess in abundance when it came to courage, determination, and an almost supernatural refusal to accept defeat. The training was brutal. The Gurkha regiments maintained standards that would break ordinary men, and for someone of Lachhiman's size, every exercise was an additional challenge. Yet he persevered, mastering the art of warfare with the same quiet determination that had carried him through years of rejection. He learned to handle the Lee-Enfield rifle, a weapon designed for larger men but which he adapted to with characteristic stubbornness. He trained with the Kukri, the curved knife that was both tool and symbol of Gurkha identity, its blade carrying centuries of warrior tradition. By 1945, as the war in Burma reached its climactic phase, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung had become exactly what the British Army needed, a soldier hardened by years of jungle warfare, seasoned by countless skirmishes against an enemy that showed no mercy and expected none in return. The Burma campaign had been a grinding, brutal affair that had lasted longer than any other theater of World War II. It was a war fought in conditions that pushed men beyond their limits, where disease killed as many as enemy bullets, where the jungle itself seemed to conspire against human survival. The strategic situation in May 1945 was fluid and dangerous. General William Slim's 14th Army had been systematically dismantling Japanese positions across Burma, but the enemy was far from finished. Japanese commanders, facing inevitable defeat, had become increasingly desperate and unpredictable. Rather than surrender, they chose to fight with a fanaticism that made them even more dangerous as the war drew to its close. The 89th Indian Infantry Brigade, part of the 7th Division, had been tasked with a crucial mission. They were to cross the mighty Irrawaddy River and destroy enemy forces north of the Taungdaw road. It was a complex operation requiring precise timing and coordination, the kind of mission that could turn the tide of the entire Burma campaign if executed successfully. By May 9th, the Japanese forces in the area, after enduring a series of devastating Allied attacks, had begun their withdrawal toward the Taungdaw Valley. It was a retreat, but not a rout. These were veteran soldiers who had fought across the Pacific, men who had conquered Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Even in retreat, they remained a formidable and deadly opponent. B and C, companies of the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, were positioned to block the Japanese escape route at the village of Taungdaw, on the western bank of the river. It seemed like a straightforward blocking action, the kind of operation that experienced units could execute with minimal casualties. The intelligence reports suggested they would be facing a demoralized and retreating enemy, soldiers more concerned with escape than with fighting. Intelligence reports, as Lachhiman Gurung and his comrades would soon discover, can be catastrophically wrong. The village of Taungdaw sat in a strategic position along the river, surrounded by dense jungle that seemed to press in from all sides like a living, breathing entity. The trees formed a canopy so thick that even during the day, the light that filtered through was green and dim. At night, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional call of nocturnal birds and the distant sound of the river flowing past. The Gurkha companies had established their positions with the professional competence that came from years of jungle warfare. Forward observation posts were placed to give early warning of enemy approach. Fields of fire were carefully cleared and marked. Supply lines were secured and communication protocols established. Everything was done according to the manual, with the methodical precision that had served the British Indian Army well throughout the campaign. But as night fell on May 12th, 1945, the situation was about to transform from a routine blocking action into something far more sinister. The Japanese forces approaching Taungdaw were not the demoralized remnants that intelligence had predicted. They were seasoned combat veterans, desperate men who knew that capture meant death, and they were coming in numbers far greater than anyone had anticipated. Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung had drawn guard duty that night, manning the forward observation post of his platoon. His position was nearly 100 yards ahead of the main company defensive line, connected to his comrades by field telephone and a jungle path that seemed to disappear into the darkness beyond his small circle of visibility. The post itself was little more than a shallow trench carved from the jungle floor, reinforced with logs and camouflaged with branches and vegetation. From this modest earthwork, Gurung could observe the narrow jungle path that wound its way up from the river valley toward the main Gurkha positions. It was a critical observation point, the eyes and ears of the entire defensive line. If the enemy came this way, he would be the first to see them. He would also be the first to die. The night air hung thick and humid, carrying the scent of rotting vegetation and the distant smell of the river. Insects buzzed in clouds around his position, drawn by the salt of his sweat and the warmth of his body. The sounds of the jungle formed a constant backdrop, a symphony of life that could easily mask the approach of death. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, every splash from the river below demanded his attention. In this environment, the difference between a falling fruit and an enemy grenade could mean the difference between life and death. Gurung checked his equipment with the methodical routine of a veteran soldier. His Lee-Enfield rifle lay across his lap, its bolt smooth and well-oiled, a round chambered and ready. Extra ammunition clips were arranged within easy reach. His Kukri hung from his belt, its curved blade sharp enough to split a hair. Hand grenades were positioned where he could grab them quickly if needed. Everything was exactly as it should be for a soldier on guard duty in hostile territory. As the hours passed, the jungle seemed to grow quieter. The normal sounds of nighttime wildlife began to fade, replaced by an ominous silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Something was wrong. In his years of jungle warfare, Gurung had learned to trust his instincts, and every instinct was now screaming that danger was approaching. At 20 minutes past midnight, the silence was broken by a sound that chilled his blood. It started as a distant murmur, like wind through the trees, but gradually resolved into something far more terrifying. The sound of hundreds of feet moving through the jungle, the creak of equipment and weapons, the whispered commands of officers trying to maintain control over a large formation moving in darkness. The Japanese were coming, and they were coming in force. Gurung reached for his field telephone, the lifeline that connected him to the main defensive positions. His whispered report was urgent, but controlled. The voice of a professional soldier doing his job under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. Enemy approaching in large numbers along the jungle path. Estimated strength at least 200 soldiers. They would reach his position within minutes. The response crackled back through the phone lines. Hold position. Observe and report. Reinforcements being prepared. But Gurung knew the mathematics of jungle warfare better than any staff officer sitting in a command bunker. The enemy would be on top of him long before any reinforcements could arrive. This was going to be his fight, and his alone. As the sounds grew louder, Gurung could make out individual voices speaking in Japanese. The enemy was advancing with confidence, apparently unaware that their approach had been detected. They moved with the practiced efficiency of veteran soldiers, but there was something else in their advance, something that spoke of desperation and determination. These were not men conducting an orderly retreat. These were warriors preparing for one final, decisive assault. The first shapes emerged from the darkness, like ghosts materializing from the jungle itself. Japanese soldiers in their distinctive uniforms, their weapons glinting in the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy above. They moved in a loose formation, spread out to avoid presenting easy targets, but still maintaining enough cohesion to deliver concentrated firepower when the moment came. Gurung counted them as they passed his position. 20, 30, 50, 100. Still they came, an endless stream of enemy soldiers flowing past his hiding place like a dark river. He had never seen so many Japanese troops in one place, and the sight filled him with a cold dread that had nothing to do with personal fear and everything to do with tactical reality. His company was about to be hit by a force that outnumbered them by at least 4 to 1. The Japanese advance guard was now less than 50 yards from his position. Individual faces were visible in the darkness, grim expressions of men who had seen too much death and were prepared to deal out more. Their equipment was worn but well maintained, their weapons clean and ready. These were not the demoralized remnants that intelligence had predicted. These were elite troops, probably veterans of campaigns across the Pacific, men who had conquered Singapore and Bataan and were not about to be stopped by a handful of Gurkhas in the Burmese jungle. The moment of decision had arrived. Gurung could have remained silent, allowed the enemy to pass, and preserved his life for another day. His position was well concealed, and in the darkness and confusion, he might have avoided detection entirely. But that was not the Gurkha way. His duty was clear, his honor was at stake, and the lives of his comrades depended on the warning he could provide and the time he could buy with his own blood. He squeezed the trigger of his Lee-Enfield rifle. The shot rang out like thunder in the humid night air, and the lead Japanese soldier crumpled to the ground. For a moment, the entire enemy column froze in surprise and confusion. Then, with the practiced efficiency of combat veterans, they reacted with devastating speed and precision. The jungle erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies as Japanese soldiers poured automatic fire into the area around Gurung's position. Bullets whined overhead and thudded into the logs of his makeshift fortification. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of small arms fire that seemed to go on forever. Gurung worked his rifle bolt and fired again, then again. Each shot was carefully aimed, each bullet finding its mark among the enemy soldiers, who were now clearly visible in the muzzle flashes of their own weapons. But for every Japanese soldier that fell, 3 more seemed to take his place. The odds were impossible, the situation hopeless. Yet still he fought on with the stubborn determination that had carried him through years of poverty and rejection. The enemy began to advance on his position, using fire and movement tactics to close the distance while maintaining suppressive fire. They were good, these Japanese soldiers, veterans who knew their business and executed it with deadly professionalism. But they were advancing against a Gurkha damned everything. Then, and that change, came the grenades. The first grenade landed with a metallic thunk on the rim of his trench, its dark shape barely visible in the chaos of muzzle flashes and screaming bullets. Without hesitation, Gurung lunged forward, grabbed the explosive device, and hurled it back into the darkness, where it detonated with a thunderous roar that momentarily silenced the gunfire. Japanese voices screamed in pain and surprise as their own weapon turned against them. But the enemy was far from finished. A second grenade arced through the night air, landing squarely in his trench just inches from his boots. The fuse was already burning, precious seconds ticking away like a countdown to oblivion. Again, Gurung seized the deadly metal sphere and launched it back toward the enemy lines. The explosion lit up the jungle like daylight for one brief, terrible moment, revealing the true scope of the force arrayed against him. Then came the third grenade. This one landed just outside his trench, close enough that he could hear the fuse hissing like an angry snake. Gurung dove forward, his hands closing around the grenade, just as he had done twice before. But fate, which had smiled upon him for those first 2 desperate moments, now turned its face away. As he raised his arm to throw the explosive back at his attackers, time ran out. The grenade detonated in his right hand. The explosion was devastating beyond imagination. White-hot fragments of metal tore through flesh and bone like a hurricane of destruction. His right hand simply ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant of searing pain and blinding light. The blast shattered his arm, sending bone fragments and muscle tissue in every direction. Burning shrapnel peppered his face, his chest, his right leg, each piece carrying with it the fury of high explosives and the promise of death. The force of the explosion threw him backward into his trench, his body a broken and bleeding wreck. Half his face was gone, transformed into a mask of blood and torn flesh. His right eye was destroyed, leaving him with only partial vision in a world that had suddenly become a nightmare of pain and confusion. Blood poured from dozens of wounds, soaking into the earth of his fighting position and mixing with the mud to create a crimson paste that spoke of mortal injury. Any normal man would have died from such wounds. The shock alone should have been enough to stop his heart, and the blood loss would have finished what the explosion had started. His 2 comrades in the forward position had been caught in the blast as well, their screams adding to the symphony of agony that filled the night air. One was already dead, his body torn apart by the same explosion that had nearly killed Gurung. The other lay dying, his life ebbing away with each labored breath. But Lachhiman Gurung was no normal man. He was a Gurkha, and Gurkhas do not surrender. They do not retreat. They do not yield ground to any enemy, no matter the odds, no matter the cost, no matter the pain that courses through their veins like liquid fire. With his left hand, the only hand he had left, Gurung reached for his kukri. The curved blade slid from its sheath with the whisper of steel on leather, its edge gleaming in the muzzle flashes that continued to strobe through the darkness. This weapon was more than just a tool of war. It was the soul of the Gurkha people, carried by warriors for over 2 centuries, blessed by tradition and tempered by countless battles. Gripping the kukri with fingers slick with his own blood, Gurung drove its point deep into the earth at the front of his trench. The blade stood upright like a monument to defiance, its presence a declaration that would echo through military history. Behind that knife, behind that simple piece of curved steel, lay the determination of a man who had been counted out his entire life but had never learned how to quit. His voice, thick with blood and pain but still carrying the authority of a warrior who had found his moment of destiny, boomed out across the battlefield. The words he spoke were in his native tongue, but their meaning needed no translation. Every Japanese soldier within hearing distance understood the challenge being thrown at their feet. Come and fight a Gurkha. The enemy response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of rifles opened fire simultaneously, their bullets whining over his position like deadly insects. The sound was beyond description, a continuous roar of destruction that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Muzzle flashes lit up the jungle in a stroboscopic display of violence, and the air itself seemed to burn with the passage of so much lead. But Gurung was no longer where they expected him to be. Despite his wounds, despite the agony that threatened to drag him into unconsciousness, he had shifted position within his trench. His Lee-Enfield rifle lay across the rim of his fighting position, its barrel steady despite the trembling of his wounded body. With his left hand, he worked the bolt action with a skill that defied the weapon's design, chambering a fresh round and settling the stock against his shoulder. The Japanese came at him in waves, their battle cries echoing through the night as they charged across the narrow stretch of jungle that separated them from his position. They came with bayonets fixed, with grenades in their hands, with the fanatical determination of men who knew that this was their last chance to break through the Allied lines. They expected to find a dead man in that forward trench, or at best a wounded soldier too broken to fight. Instead, they found hell incarnate. Gurung's first shot dropped the lead attacker at point-blank range, the heavy 303 bullet punching through the man's chest and spinning him around like a child's toy. Before the body had even hit the ground, Gurung was working his bolt again, his left hand moving with practiced efficiency despite the blood that made everything slippery and uncertain. The second shot followed within seconds, then the third, each one finding its mark among the advancing enemy soldiers. The Japanese faltered, confused by the accurate fire coming from a position they had assumed was neutralized. Their charge broke up into individual rushes as soldiers sought cover behind trees and fallen logs, trying to identify the source of the deadly shooting that was cutting down their comrades with mechanical precision. But there was no cover from a Gurkha who had decided to die fighting. Gurung could see them clearly in the muzzle flashes of their own weapons, their faces painted with fear and determination in equal measure. He fired again and again, each shot claiming another life, each empty case ejecting into the mud of his trench to join the growing pile of brass that marked his stand against impossible odds. The enemy tried to flank his position, sending soldiers through the jungle on either side of the narrow path. But the terrain worked in Gurung's favor, channeling their advance into killing zones where his rifle could find them. He shifted his fire from target to target, never allowing the Japanese to mass for another coordinated assault, never giving them the chance to rush his position en masse. Hours passed in a blur of violence and pain. The Japanese attacked again and again, each assault more desperate than the last. They threw grenades that exploded harmlessly behind his position. They poured automatic fire into his trench until the logs were splintered and torn. They screamed challenges and curses in their own language, trying to break his will through sheer volume of sound and fury. But Lachhiman Gurung had found something beyond courage in that blood-soaked trench. He had found purpose. Every shot he fired bought precious time for his comrades to prepare their defenses. Every Japanese soldier he killed was one fewer enemy that would reach the main company position. Every minute he held that forward post was another minute for reinforcements to arrive, or for the Allied artillery to range in on the enemy formation. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. He was one man against more than 200. His ammunition was limited, his strength was failing, and his blood continued to flow into the mud of Burma. Logic dictated that he should have been dead within the first few minutes of the engagement, but logic had no place in the heart of a Gurkha who had planted his Kukri in the earth and sworn that none would pass. When the sun finally rose over the Burmese jungle on May 13th, 1945, the silence that followed was more profound than any gunfire. 31 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of Lachhiman Gurung's position, testimony to 4 hours of impossible courage. The man they had dismissed as too small to matter had proven that greatness is not measured in inches, but in the refusal to surrender when everything depends on your stand. His Victoria Cross citation would later read that had his position fallen, the entire defensive line would have collapsed. One wounded Gurkha, fighting with a single arm, had held the fate of his entire company in his bloodied hands and refused to let it fall.